Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin with Jurassic Magic, and I first have to say I have been super impressed with Tarkir Dragonstorm. This was the one I was most excited for out of all the sets in this entire year, and it's not even close. I have about one more video about Tarkir Dragonstorm unless you guys want to see any other commanders built. However, today I am going to go over Betor Kin to All, and this is actually a deck I've been randomly brewing because I pulled it out of my pre-release pack and it got me excited. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get it started. Let's talk about Betor Kin to All. So first, let's read what this commander does for 2 white, black, and a green. It's a legendary creature, Spirit Dragon with flying. At the beginning of your end step, if creatures you control have total toughness of 10 or greater, draw a card. Then if creatures you control have total toughness 20 or greater, untap each creature you control. Then if creatures you control have total toughness 40 or greater, each opponent loses half their life rounded up. So first of all, I have to say I am a sucker for the art. I love the new showcase version. I pulled it out one of my collector boosters and I thought, okay, I have to build a deck around this, and I'll just say this now, this deck is very unorthodox what you would think of with Betor. A lot of people are thinking of those huge toughness creatures like the 2 trees of Tree of Redemption and Tree of Perdition, and if you wanted to throw them in the deck, you totally could. I feel personally you could go a different route. Obviously Abzan focus on 1/1 counters, and that's the direction I'm going towards, because I don't want to necessarily just throw in a lot of big butts on the battlefield and call it good. I would rather put a lot of decent creatures and buff them all up and get all of Betor's abilities online that way. And I feel like there's a lot of ways of doing that. And just to kind of give you a breakdown of this video and what I'm going to be discussing, I'm going to talk about key synergy pieces with Betor. Then later on, I'll talk about the 1/1 counter strategy. And then in the next discussion topic, I will focus on hydras. That's actually a big theme in this list because hydras focus on 1/1 counters. And honestly, I've been wanting a hydra deck for quite a while that kind of fits into the Abzan color combination, because there's some hydras that have Golgari color combination or Selesnya color combination that I'll discuss later on. And then finally, I will discuss some win cons. But first things first, let's talk about early game and what we want to achieve. So in this type of deck, you want to have a lot of early game options, whether it's ramp, card advantage, or accelerating your game plan in some sort of way. Of course, since we are in green, there are a ton of options as far as ramp goes. We definitely don't need to go into that. You got your classics like Farseek and Nature's Lore, or 3 Visits. I know I mentioned them in every green video, but trust me, they're the essentials. There are some other great ramp options, like Mana Dorks, that you could take advantage of too, because of course they will have a toughness, even if it's like a little bit. I like Kami of Whispered Hopes because essentially it is a hardened scales on the battlefield, all the while being a mana dork. And of course, the more counters you put on Kami of Whispered Hopes, the more you could tap for mana essentially. Of course, you'll also want to throw in some interaction, and since we're in Abzan colors, there is a ton of options as far as removal goes. To name some of the classics, Assassin's Trophy, Swords to Plowshares, or even Anguish Unmaking. I love Anguish Unmaking, even though I feel like it's getting kind of power crept out of the format. But I do like the fact that it's going to remove anything on the battlefield that's a non-land, and exiling it. Most importantly, I feel like exile removal is important more now than ever, mainly because of a lot of graveyard strategies. Because we are in the counter strategy, Damning Verdict is excellent. Even though it is 5 mana, it's a little bit more expensive than, say for example, a Wrath of God, which is basically the standard for board wipes. But I would say this is definitely better in our situation because you destroy all creatures with no counters on them. This is going to destroy a ton of creatures on the battlefield, all the while all our creatures are most likely going to have a ton of counters on them where they don't get destroyed at all. So of course there's some ramp and interaction, but there is also some good card draw that you can put in this deck. Esper Sentinel is a great one, even though it is pretty expensive right now, around like 40 bucks. It is probably one of your best card draw options, especially in this color combination. I'm more of the type where if it's that expensive, I'd totally proxy it, and this one is definitely worth it in the deck, mainly because we are in a counters theme. The more counters we put on Esper Sentinel, more likely that our opponents are not going to be paying for that tax, and then we get a draw card. Another card draw option that actually works with the counter strategy is Hollow Merc Siege. This is incredible because you could choose Sultai or Abzan. In this weird situation, you're going to be choosing Sultai, at least in my opinion. Whenever a counter is put on a creature you control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. That is super powerful for us because we're putting counters on our guys at all times usually. Even though Abzan can be pretty useful whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains menace until end of turn. That could be useful in that aggressive strategy, but I personally would like the card draw better. And over time, the longer this sticks on the battlefield and the more counters we put on creatures, most most likely we're going to get the value out of this completely. I also want to focus on a card draw option that also doubles as a protection spell. Inspiring Call is one of the better options that you can throw on this deck. Draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. So if we have like 5 creatures on the battlefield and they all have 1/1 counters, well, hey look, we'll draw 5 cards. But not only that, those creatures will gain indestructible until end of turn. This is extremely powerful in those situations. If somebody casts that Wrath of God, well, hey, I will just cast this and the creatures we control will gain indestructible as long as they have those counters. So yeah, I just wanted to give a quick summary as far as the basics go. I've been trying to do that more in my videos because I just wanted to share with you some of my thought processes on the early game and how we want to develop our board. Since we are in a counters theme, there are a ton of options that you could choose from. I first wanted just to give you a quick brief overview of some of the options that are personally the best. I wanted to highlight some that basically increase the counters that you're already going to be putting on your creatures. For example, the classic Hardened Scales. If you put 1/1 counter on a creature or more, you put an additional 1/1 counter on it too. So that is pretty useful in most situations, especially 1 mana for that. One step above that would be the Ozla Shattered Spire. It's basically another version of Hardened Scales, but with additional benefits. You could tap it to put a 1/1 counter on target artifact or creature you control. You could only activate it as a sorcery, and if you don't need it later in the game, you could just cycle it away. So this is a lot more versatile. Of course, let's talk about the big brother, the Ozlith. For 1 mana, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozlith. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, the Ozlith has counters on it. You may remove all counters from the Ozlith onto a target creature. So like your commander, where it could get extra huge, or another creature you control. So that way you can kind of keep the toughness around. There are some cards that technically kind of synergize with counters, but in the form of modification. Kodama of the West Tree and Cutsil Mammolet Exemplar are perfect because they both act as card draw and ramp. Kodama, whenever you swing with a creature that has a modification on it, you get to put a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And with Cutsil Mammolet Exemplar, whenever one of our creatures you control, each with power greater than its base power, deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So if they just have a 1/1 counter on it, it's going to be greater than their base power, so when they deal combat damage, you get to draw a card. If you swing at 3 different people with those 3 different kind of creatures, you get to draw 3 cards. And not only that, it acts as a Grand Abolisher, so say goodbye to counter spells or people trying to remove your cards on the battlefield on your turn because they can't cast anything. From the same set, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Sovereign Okenek Au is really busted. Whenever it attacks, for each creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. So let's just say you had a 1/1 on the battlefield and it had 2 1/1 counters on it. You swing in with Sovereign. That 1/1 with the 2 1/1 counters on it will grow to a 5/5, essentially having 4 1/1 counters on it. And that does apply for all creatures you control, including Sovereign itself if it's buffed up. So this one is extremely powerful in the right type of situation. Diving a little deeper into the counter synergy, Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, is incredible in this deck too, because this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. And not only that, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. This seems absolutely absurd in this kind of deck where we want to cast a big giant hydras and other giant creatures. Reducing them based off of the 1/1 counters you have on each creature is going to mean we're going to be casting things for a lot cheaper and a lot bigger. You can also double the number of 1/1 counters you put on creatures you control with like Branching Evolution, along with Corpse Jack Menace. If 1 or more counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many of 1/1 counters are put on it instead. So these are basically insane. Just doubling the number of 1/1 counters or putting on your creatures can really uptick to the point where we might even get to Betor's last ability pretty easily and pretty quickly. So you probably thought everything was great until this point of the video. Why would you want to put hydras in the deck? Well, there's a lot of reasons. To me personally, hydras are very cool, and there was one inspiration for this video actually, and that's Warden of the Grove. I opened this out of a collector booster pack with Betor, and I thought I really want to make this kind of deck. I have about 50% of it in paper and decided I wanted to just go for it. And then I thought to myself, I have all these other hydras, and with the 1/1 counter synergy, it just kind of made sense to me because hydras are ever evolving and ever growing, and of course that'll get to our strategy faster with Betor, getting all 3 of those modes online pretty quickly. But why am I so impressed with Warden of the Grove? For 2 and a green, so it's 3 mana total. At the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, so this by itself is going to increase over time. But not only that, whenever another non-token creature you control enters, it endures X, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. And I read it as +1/+1 counters. It's any kind of counter, so if you have an indestructible counter on it, it does work too. but most likely we're going to be having 1/1 counters on this. But if you're not familiar with Enduring, you put X 1/1 counters on the creature that entered or create a XX White Spirit creature token. So this could have great synergy with a lot of creatures we have entering the battlefield. Let's just say there's just one 1/1 counter on Warden of the Grove and we have another creature enter the battlefield. We could have it enter with an additional +1/+1 counter, or we can make a 1/1 White Spirit creature token. And obviously the more counters we do have Warden of the Grove, the more we could buff up a creature or make a huge creature on the battlefield. So either way, it's a very fun card. Definitely something I'm absolutely excited to try myself. Of course, there are a ton of other hydras that you could utilize in the deck. Just to name a couple, Mana Gorger Hydra. This just gets bigger over time in the game whenever a player casts a spell. And let me tell you, this gets out of hand fast because of course you have 3 other opponents that you're facing up against and they're going to be casting spells during their turn or not on their turn. Most likely this will get huge and we could get to our commander's abilities almost immediately. Another card similar to Mana Gorger Hydra would be Mossborn Hydra. This is another great card at 3 CMC. It will enter with a 1/1 counter on it, and whenever a land you control enters, double the number of 1/1 counters on this creature. And trust me, I've played this and this gets huge absolutely fast. Of course, the more 1/1 counters we do put on it immediately, and then when we cast a land, we're just doubling them. It's just, trust me, just put it in the deck. Also, for a little while I've been wanting to put 2 different versions of Polukranos in a deck: Polukranos Reborn, or otherwise known as Polukranos Engine of Ruin, as well as Polukranos Unchained. Both of these are pretty good for this Hydra deck. Polukranos Reborn doesn't really have anything on the front side besides reach and with a 4/5 body, but for 3 mana, having a 5 toughness is actually pretty huge in this deck, by the way. However, when you flip it over into the other option with Engine of Ruin, it's basically just a Wormcoil engine where your Hydra's dying. You get to make 2 3/3 tokens, one with lifelink and one with reach, so that way we can kind of swarm the board a little bit more with some Hydras. I do also enjoy Polukranos Unchained mainly because I used to play it in Standard a long time ago in a standard janky deck. It enters the battlefield with 6 1/1 counters on it, and if it would be dealt damage while it has 1/1 counters on it, prevent that damage and remove that many +1/+1 counters on it. And not only that, you can pay 1 black and a green and it'll fight another target creature. So this is great removal on the battlefield, and it could stay behind because it'll prevent the damage to it, but it'll lose the counter in the process, which is not that great. But again, it does have escape for 6 mana. You have to exile 6 other cards from your graveyard, and when it does escape, it'll enter as a 12/12, which is obviously great for our commander. So as a big Greek fan and Theros fan, I think Polukranos is a wonderful option in this deck, more as a nostalgia option. The same can be applied for Hero's Bane. For quite a stretch in 2016 and 2017, I got a lot of different packs, whether they're intro decks or bundles. I played them with friends, and this is one card that I had in a promo pack, and I immediately fell in love with it because of how cool it looked. I know this is not the best thing in the world, it's only 35 cents, but I think it can work very well in this commander deck. This creature enters with 4 1/1 counters on it, and you can pay 4 mana in the activated ability, put X 1/1 counters on this creature where X is its power, so you pay 4 into that cost, it'll become an 8/8, then after that a 16/16, and then a 32/32, then so on and so forth. I just love this card for the nostalgia I have for Magic the Gathering when I was playing in my early days. Even though it's not the most optimal choice, it's one I'm just putting in the deck because I love it, and you can't say a single thing about it. But moving on, let's focus on another Hydra, and this one will potentially win you a lot of games, and that's Colonian Hydra. It enters with 4 1/1 counters on it, and when it attacks, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, so it's basically just a better version of Hero's Bane. This is incredibly strong in this type of deck. When it swings in, it's going to be swinging for 8 total damage the first time because it's an attack trigger, and with all your other creatures, it's just doubling the number of 1/1 counters on them, so this will help us get to 40 in no time. And of course, there are many other Hydras in the list. Those are just some of my personal favorites. So Betor itself can be a win con, especially if you get to that last mode. Simply just making each opponent lose half their life rounded up can be crazy, especially with something like Bloodletter of Aclazotz, because when your opponents lose half the life, they're going to lose the other half of their life with the Bloodletter's ability. Another win con that can be in this deck is Zopandrel Hunger Dominus and Unnatural Growth, because they're essentially the same thing. However, Zopandrel is a creature with a toughness of 6 for now, because when you go to your combat, and really each combat, double double the power and toughness of each creature you control until on a turn. So Zopandro itself will become a 8-12, and if you have your commander out on the battlefield, it'll become a 10-14. And if you have really any other creatures on the battlefield, most likely you're going to get to that 40 pretty easily. So then simply your opponents will lose half their life rounded up. But let's be real, if you had Zopandro or Unnatural Growth on the battlefield with a lot of creatures, most likely you're going to be closing out the game before they lose half their life rounded up with your commander's ability. So that is something worth mentioning. But one last win con I wanted to highlight is last March of the Ents. And normally I would put this in card draw options, but however, this is truly just a win con. Especially at 8 mana, this spell can't be countered. Draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, then put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And this is the one reason why I do have Surek and Goreclaw in the deck, because when those creatures enter the battlefield, they'll get a 1/1 counter on them and gain haste. Most likely with these two cards, it is really hard, and I mean extremely hard, to lose the game after that point, because let's just say you draw 20 cards off of the last March of the Ents and put that many creatures from your hand onto the battlefield, which again is pretty easy to do in this type of deck. And if you have Surek and Goreclaw on the battlefield with haste and giving your creatures haste, it is going to be spelling good game for your opponents most likely. I seriously think last March of the Ents is a very busted Magic card. I know a lot of people say, well, it's 8 mana and you need to have a creature on the battlefield, and they're probably right. However, this is seriously just absolutely powerful, and if you're wanting a good win con, this is definitely one of the better options in my opinion. However, with that said, that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on Betor Kin to All. I do have a deck list down below in the description if you wanted to go check it out for yourself. There is some of the pre-con cards like Canopy Gargantuan that I didn't mention in this video, but obviously we're great includes regardless. But I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts down below in the comments? Do you feel like this idea is pretty crazy for me to put hydras in this list? I personally think it's more of a fun option. I wanted Abzan hydras for quite a while, and I thought this commander is pretty fitting, even though it necessarily doesn't have to do anything with hydras. I just think with the amount of hydras growing exponentially over time, I feel like you could get to that 40 toughness pretty easily, and getting all those abilities of card draw, untapping your creatures, and making your opponents lose half their life rounded up. So you better stay tuned, because I'm going to be doing a new deck brew around Tival the Balanced Scale. It'll be one of my last videos of Tarkir Dragonstorm, so definitely hit the notification bell so you don't miss it yourself. Also, if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stopping by.